Hello, reading room. We are here, not finishing up, but we're getting near the end. We are for sure 3/4 of the way through, 25% more to go on our book, on our classic story, Heidi. We are on chapter 17, A Recompense. Let's see here. Peter came up with his goats the next morning as usual, and with him the doctor. This good gentleman had done his best to engage the goat herd in conversation, but had scarcely been able to extract an intelligible monosyllable in answer to his question. Peter was not easily trapped into communicativeness. So the silent company clambered up the steep hill to the elm hut, where Heidi stood awaiting them with her goats, all three as bright and happy as the early sunbeams. "Are you coming with us?" said Peter, who repeated this question every morning, either in the form of an invitation or a challenge. "Of course I am, if the doctor is going," answered Heidi. Peter eyed the person named a little askance. After the elm uncle had greeted his guest with affectionate warmth, he hung the lunch bag over Peter's shoulder. The lad found it heavier than usual by the addition of a large piece of delicate dried meat. Should the good doctor be pleased with the pasture, he might like to stay to eat lunch with the children. Peter stood grinning from ear to ear, for he suspected some unusual luxury. They began the ascent. Here, let me do it this way. They began the ascent. The guests surrounded Heidi, each one wishing for the place beside her, and each pushing and crowding his neighbor a little. So for a while, she was carried along with them and did not resist. We still don't have that there where we need it. Let's do this a little bit. There we go. At last she stood still, saying in a warning voice, "Now you must all run on properly and not keep coming back to push and crowd me. I must walk a little with the doctor." Then tapping Snowball, who was always nearest her, gently on the shoulder, bidding her be especially good today, she worked her way out of the flock, ran back to her friend, took his hand, and held it tightly in hers. There was not much trouble in finding subjects of conversation with this little companion, who began at once about the goats and their droll freaks, about the flowers and the rocks, the birds and the snowfield, so that the time flew by and they were at the summit without knowing it. Meanwhile, Peter had cast many a threatening glance sidewise at the doctor, which might have caused the gentleman some uneasiness, but which fortunately he did not notice. As soon as they reached their usual resting place, Heidi took the doctor to her favorite seat where the view was finest. Seating themselves on the sunny grass, they looked about them. The heights above and the green valley were swimming in the golden autumn sunshine. From some lower alp, the faint tinkling cowbells came sweetly and softly like a song of peace, and all the air was filled with pleasant sounds. On the great snowfield, above golden sunbeams, glowed and shimmered here and there, while gray old Falcons raised his rocky towers in majestic silence, standing strongly contrasted against the blue of heaven. The morning wind blew softly and caressingly, tenderly stirring the last blue harebells, which had outlived their companions of the great army of summer flowers, and now stood languidly waving their drooping heads in the warm sunlight. Overhead, the great, there they are sitting there. Overhead, The great eagle circled, gracefully sweeping flight. Today he did not scream, but with widespread wings floated silently through the air in ecstasy of motion. Heidi looked everywhere, at everything. All was so full of beauty. With sparkling eyes, she glanced at her old friend to be sure that he too saw as she did. As his eyes encountered Heidi's dancing with joy and happiness, he said, "Yes, dear child, it may be all lovely, but how can one who carries a sad heart in his bosom feel the charm properly or rejoice?" "Oh," cried the child with untouched gladness, "no one here carries a sad heart in his bosom. Only in Frankfurt are there such." The doctor smiled a little, but fleetingly. Then he said, "If someone came from Frankfurt bringing all his sadness with him, what could be done to help him here? Do you know, Heidi?" "If such a one does not know how to help himself, then he must tell all to the good God," she said confidently. "That is a good thought, my child. But if he knows that his sorrow comes from God, what then can help him in his misery?" Heidi had to think for a time about this new problem, though she was perfectly convinced that God could provide a balm for all sorrow. She sought for an answer from her own experience. "One must wait," she said after a while, and must always think that soon the good God will bring something to make one happier. That something will come out of the trouble, but one must keep perfectly quiet and not run away. After a while, it will be quite plain how God had all the time something good in his thoughts, though we did not know it. "Always keep that beautiful belief, Heidi," said the doctor. For a while he sat silent, gazing now at the rocky pinnacles, now into the gleaming valley. During all this time, the goat herd had been fully occupied in giving vent to his vexation. It was so long since Heidi had been to the pasture with him, and to see her now, sitting there with that old gentleman, and with never a word for him, was more than Peter could endure. It made him very angry. Placing himself in a hollow behind the unsuspicious doctor, where there was no danger of being seen, he doubled up his fist, one fist, and swung it in the air, and then two fists, and repeated the pantomime. And the longer they sat there, the more vigorous and frightful became his action, and the higher he swung his fists in the air behind their backs. But the sun had now reached the place in heavens that indicated the time for their midday meal. Perceiving this, the lad shouted suddenly, as loud as he could, "It's time to eat!" Heidi rose at once and wished to bring the bag to the place where they were sitting, so that her friend might eat without disturbing himself, but he declared that he was not hungry and would only drink a glass of milk, and then climbed higher up the mountain. Then Heidi discovered that she too was not hungry and would only drink some milk, and furthermore would bring the doctor to the great moss-grown stone where Thistlebird had almost fallen over once, and where the sweetest and most nourishing herbs grew. So she ran over to Peter to explain to him that he was to get a glass of milk for the doctor first, and then one for her from Schwanli. The lad gazed at Heidi in astonishment for a moment, and then said, "Who will have what is in the basket?" "You may have it," she said, "but first fetch the milk, and quickly." Never yet had Peter accomplished any action so promptly as he did this. The contents of the satchel seemed always before his eyes, and he longed to get at it. As soon as his companions had begun to drink their milk, he opened the lunch bag and peeped in. When he saw the wonderful piece of meat, he trembled for joy and peeped again to make quite sure. Slowly he put his hand into the bag, then quickly withdrew it, as if really afraid to take what was there. It had suddenly come into Peter's head how he had been standing behind the gentleman who had given him all the superb feast, and had threatened him with his fist, and sorrow for this conduct prevented him from eating his dinner with satisfaction. After a moment or two he sprang up, and running to the hollow again, stretched out his hands in the air, and made signs of smoothing out all the motions he had before made of hatred that he had before made of hatred and anger. He continued this strange action until he felt satisfied that he had obliterated all indications of unkindness and could return to eat his longed for dinner with a good conscience. Heidi and her companion went wandering meanwhile over the pasture and enjoying themselves exceedingly, but at last the doctor found it was time for him to return, while it occurred to him that the little girl might well like to play about a while with the goats. Heidi had no thought of such a thing. Could she let the doctor go all the way down the Alp alone? She had still a great deal to tell him, to point out the spots where in summer there were myriads of lovely flowers. She must tell him all their names, for her grandfather had taught them all to her. At last, however, the doctor took leave of his little companion, sending her back while he himself went down the mountain. But as he turned back now and then, he saw the child still standing where he had left her and waving her hand, just as his own little daughter had stood watching him every day when he left the house. The whole month was a series of beautiful, clear, sunny days. Each morning the doctor climbed up the elm and went off for a ramble. Generally he went with the uncle high up amongst the rocks, where stood the old weather-beaten pines and overtopped the crags, and where nested in great birds of prey, which startled would fly screaming over their heads. In the companionship of the elm uncle, the doctor found the greatest pleasure, and was more and more surprised at conversation and at the knowledge he showed of all the mountain herbs, their healing qualities, and where they grew, as well as the curly mosses that nested among the gnarled roots of the old pine trees, and the almost invisible flowers hidden in the alpine soil. His knowledge was great, too, of the habits of the animals thereabout, and he told many a humorous story of the tricks and gambols of those dwellers in caves and rocks, and of the inhabitants of the high treetops. The time passed so quickly that day after day the evening surprised them before they were aware of its approach, and the doctor constantly said in taking leave at sundown, "I will never pass the day in your company without learning something new and valuable." But on many days, and those the finest, the doctor chose to go with his little friend. They sat together on the lovely spur of the Alp, where they had sat the first morning, and the child repeated her hymns and songs, and told her old friend all her bits of knowledge and all her thoughts. Peter sat behind them in his old place in the hollow. He did not, however, double his fist. He was quite tame, and so the lovely month of September drew to an end. One morning the doctor came up with a clouded countenance. He must go back to Frankfurt, he said, and the thought made him sad, for he loved the elm and his friendly faces, and was sorry to leave them. The elm uncle was sorry too, for he had become much interested in the good doctor, and as for Heidi, she did not know how to think of being deprived of the companionship of her dear old friend, and looked at him long and beseechingly. "Come down the mountain a little with me, Heidi," said the doctor, when he had bade adieu to the uncle. Heidi put her hand in that of her friend, and they went, but the child could not grasp the idea that he was really leaving them. "Now you must go back to your grandfather, my child." And the doctor passed his hand several times tenderly over her curly hair. "And I must go. Oh, Heidi, how I wish I could take you back with me and keep you always." At these words, all Frankfurt rose before the child's eyes, the many, many houses, the stone streets, Miss Rottenmeier, and Annette, and she said rather doubtfully, "I should like far better to have you come to us." "Yes, that certainly would be better. So farewell, Heidi." And the doctor held out his hand kindly to her. Looking into his face, Heidi saw that his eyes were full of tears, but he said nothing more and turned away quickly to go down the mountain. Heidi stood still. Those loving eyes and the tears therein touched her tender heart. Suddenly she burst forth weeping and ran after her departing friend, calling with all her might, "Doctor, doctor!" The doctor turned just as Heidi reached his side. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she sobbed out, "I will go with you to Frankfurt and stay as long as you want me, but first let me go tell my grandfather." The doctor soothed gently the excited child. "No, my dear Heidi," he said tenderly, "not just now. You must stay a while longer under the pines, or you would soon be ill again. But come, I will make a request of you. If I am ever sick and alone, will you come to me then and stay with me? May I feel sure that I have someone who will care for me and love me? Yes, I will surely come on the very day, for I love you almost as much as I do my grandfather, said the still sobbing child. Pressing her hand fondly, the doctor turned away while Heidi stood and waved him farewell as long as she could see him. Tomorrow, Chapter 18, Winter in Dorfli. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are here keeping our minds, our bodies, and our spirits healthy. That is the classic story that we're reading, Heidi. Thanks for joining me.